Today we are going to dive into the Holy Bible, the King James 1611 version, containing the Old Testament with its Deuterocanon or Apocrypha, and the New Testament, translated out of the Hebrew and Greek languages, and with the former translations diligently compared by His Majesty King James Stewart, who was a Scotsman. His version of the Bible from 1611. It includes again the entire Hebrew Deuterocanon or Apocrypha, which was removed from the modern Bible versions in 1886. Table of contents, the Bible canon, introductions, details and appendices. Table of contents, a little bit of information about the wisdom of Jesus ben Sirach, design done here, created in 1654. Contents continued. It has a hint here. Notice on color code, the beautiful trim strips over the book titles are not only decoration. Black, explanatory text. Red, Old Testament Hebrew Bible first canon. Green, Deuterocanon Apocrypha second canon. Blue, New Testament Christian Bible or canon. No strip, the book belongs to the previous book. Notice of timing and dating with language. The authors or these printers, publishers, these people who have presented it, define what we stand for. As a matter of principle in our books, we only use the term BC, before Christ, or AD Anno Domini, which is the Latin term, the year of the Lord. These are not only religious terms but also reveal a person's cultural consciousness and allegiance. Terms like BCE or BCE, before Common Era, CE or CE, or C.E or CE, Common Era, are politically correct nonsense, since common also means ordinary and thus ideologically refers to an era of insignificance, and are used by all those who do not wish to refer to God or Christ or the achievements of the Western world in general. From the Guildford Scientific Press. Preliminary, foreword, introduction 1 and 2. Foreword. We live in an age of religious extremism, an age of terror and violent slaughter. This is probably referring to 1611. We are locked in a bewildering ideological battle with religious fundamentalism. It is a battle that has taken most of us by surprise because religious fundamentalism seems so odd, so alien to our, maybe this is the Guildford Press in their expression, to our own easy-going way of life. But you know, it is not. We have been here before, here at home, here at the very heart of our own civilization. About 500 years ago, a breach within Christianity tore Europe, England, and the Church apart. Was that the Reformation? It was the same literalism, the same passionate intensity, the same apocalyptic violence as now. It is our very own jihad. It's what they say here. It is called the Reformation. Okay, so it was the Reformation. The Protestant Reformation, or the Protestant, because they were protesters, they wanted reform. They called out to the Roman Catholic Church, the papacy at the time, there's something awfully wrong here. You need to make it a reformation, the church and your dogmas, etc. The Protestant Reformation was also a political and cultural revolution. It unleashed bloodshed, terror, and the destruction of religion, religious art, a combination we recognise all too well. It began with a provincial German monk, Martin Luther, and it threatened the most powerful institution in the Western world, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, with destruction. It could have fell apart. Okay. Could have been ruined, in ruin, because of this. In England, it led to a hard Brexit, 16th century style, as King Henry VIII broke with Rome and declared himself supreme head on earth of the Church of England, because he was one of those that believed he had the right to divorce Whereas the Roman Catholic Church said, no, you can't do that. He says, well, I'm the king, I can do that, and so forth. It was a tale of espionage, enhanced interrogation, and horrific death. There was a handful of brave and inspired souls who fought to introduce the new ideas, and the authorities fought back savagely to stamp out the infection. So, how did one man's simple act of protest in the backwoods of Germany spark a violent revolution that would transform England, Europe, and the Western world? In the early 1500s, the Catholic Church shaped every aspect of human life, and in Rome, its head, the Pope, ruled a spiritual empire bigger than that of the Caesars, or the Roman Caesars, or emperors. It is hard to overestimate the power of the Catholic Church in the late Middle Ages. It was a vastly wealthy, bureaucratic machine, the very heart of Europe. It controlled education, media, family law. It had its own private language in Latin, the old Latin, right? The clergy, whatever their nationality, swore obedience to the Pope, whose toe even kings knelt on the ground to kiss, but his greatest power was over men's minds. Churches were dominated by a huge painting of the Last Judgment, when Jesus' judge sentenced each soul to the joys of heaven or the eternal torments of hell. It was a terrifying vision. The Church mitigated its stark horror by the doctrine of purgatory, that souls go to a place like limbo, and common people can pray for them and donate money, put money in the coffers, and then they'll move on. This was an intermediate state between heaven and hell, where the not too sinful soul was purged of its offences and made fit to enter paradise. You could reduce the amount of time you spent in purgatory, or your loved ones that had passed, by doing good works, saying prayers, going on pilgrimages, giving to the poor, or you could draw on the good works of others. Jesus, the saints, the Virgin Mary, whose transcendent goodness had endowed the Church with the treasury of merit. The Pope dispensed, in return for consideration, of course, this treasury in the form of spiritual IOUs, known as indulgences, an IOU abbreviated from the phrase IOU. IOU. Used to get those on the buses here. When you couldn't get on the bus and you need to get home, you'd sign an IOU paper, and you get on a bus for free, and you have to pay it back later. These were printed bits of paper that, in return for cold hard cash, absorbed the soul of its offences and acted as its passport to paradise. So you had to put money, coin, into their coffers, or their plate, right? Donation plate, for these people to move on in purgatory. Indulgences were often sold to finance church schemes. In 1517, the Pope's pet project was the rebuilding of St. Peter's on a magnificent scale. Indulgences were sold across Europe. There was even a catchy advertising jingle: as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. It was as though the Church had forgotten Christ and become fixated on wealth. And for one German monk, this was an abomination. On the 31st of October 1517, Martin Luther very publicly denounced the scandal. According to legend, he strode through the town to the great doors of All Saints Church and hammered up a document for all to see. It was his 95 thesis, a mere 95 points of contention with the Church's teaching on sin and penance. Were these the brave hammer blows of fate against the old order, as the traditional story goes, or was it the equivalent of pinning an agenda on a university notice board, as revisionists suggest? Actually, it doesn't much matter, since nobody disputes the magnitude of the result. Luther's protest would plunge Europe into 2 centuries of religious war, unleashing bloodshed and brutality across the continent, all in the name of God. Martin Luther was an unlikely revolutionary. In 1517, he was a 33-year-old monk, and professor of biblical theology at the University of Wittenberg in Saxony. Saxony was just a small one of the German-speaking states that comprised present-day Germany. Each had its own ruler, but all fell under the overlordship of an elected monarch, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was crowned by the Pope, and all was subject to papal authority and taxation. In the introduction to his thesis, Luther wrote of his wish to stir up debate. A new invention allowed him to succeed beyond his wildest dreams. Just over 70 years earlier, Johannes Gutenberg had developed his printing press. This piece of technology would transform Luther from a little-known monk and academic into Europe's most published author and a wanted man, because the Roman Catholic Church at the time didn't want him revealing those scriptures, etc., or exposing them. Perhaps the label a heretic, etc., etc. Luther originally wrote the 95 Theses in Latin, the language of academic and theological discourse. But even within the Latin of the Theses, Luther showed himself aware of that wider audience outside the universities, and 9 of the Theses list the sharp arguments that the laity were using against indulgences, and how Luther asks, are we going to answer those arguments if the church does not reform itself? Well, of course, the church showed no sign of reforming itself. So what Luther did was to write a tract. He called it A Sermon on Indulgences and Grace, and he wrote it in German, and he had it printed, obviously using the Gutenberg press that was available. You put out more, distribute more copies successfully. What you have read up to this point here are the spoken words of Dr. David Starkey, one of the very few historians living today, don't know if he's still alive, who understand the magnitude of religious propaganda in detail. Starkey is fully aware that the language is the main key if we want to fully grasp what religion is all about and how it works. He is one of the most outspoken historians of our time, who is able to assemble historical facts in a logical way and presents them as eloquent narrative with a cohesion that everyone can follow with ease. In 2017, he published a BBC documentary called Reformation, Europe's Holy War. You might want to watch that, might be on YouTube, in which he compared Luther's Reformation with our modern upheavals of woke and jihad. With Clan, he describes what went on, and it's with, is that with, just check that word. Okay, we think it's Clan, but it's probably Elan. Okay, just have a look at that word. Yeah, with Elan, E-L-A-N. He describes what went on in the 16th century revolution. Experts still marvel at the extraordinary impact of Luther's sermons on indulgences and grace. This was the work which propelled Luther to the front ranks of European thought and theology. Until that point, he had been writing in Latin for the scholars, but when he published these 20 short propositions in German, he brought his thoughts not only to the mind of scholars, but to each and every ordinary person, which wasn't allowed at that time. And they weren't allowed to learn Latin, they weren't allowed to read it, read the Bible, etc., etc., right? They just had to rely on these Roman Catholic priests and the papacy, etc. The form in German very closely echoes the 95 Theses written in Latin that he did. A language that the man in the street could not understand. It's deliberately done so they wouldn't be able to read the Bible and say, hey, that's not right, what you're telling us is not right, that's dogma, you're pulling the wool over our eyes. Yeah, it's a way to control the people, the masses probably. The form in German very closely echoes the 95 Theses written in Latin, a language that the man in the street could not understand. The short German version of the 95 Theses are a work of instinctive brilliance. Luther calls it a sermon, but it is nothing like a sermon. Sermons are meant to be endurance tests of repetition and reiteration. But this little paper can be read aloud in 10 minutes. It is 20 short, snappy points, but unlike the 95 Theses, which circulate only in the intellectual community. This spread immediately like wildfire across Central Europe. Who was this Luther? So it's like those little tracts that you get from Christian bookshops. Probably something like that. Little booklets with all this information in it, or something like that. It's probably the forerunner of those. Short standard answer. Martin Luther was a German theologian, religious reformer and monk who was the catalyst of the 16th century Protestant Reformation. Through his words and actions, Luther precipitated a movement that reformulated certain basic tenets of Christian belief and resulted in the division of Western Christendom between Roman Catholicism and the new Protestant traditions, mainly Lutheranism, Calvinism, the Anglican Communion, the Anabaptists, and the Anti-Trinitarians. He is one of the most influential figures in the history of Christianity, and rightfully so. So, after his revolutionary Reformation, etc., a lot of people broke away from the Roman Catholic Church and they formed these offshoots, okay, like Lutheranism, Wesleyism, etc. But they're still basically following the tenets of the Roman Catholic Church. They're still attached to it in many ways, still honouring it, all that sort of stuff, in their dress or their garb and the traditions, the methods, etc., the rituals that they followed. Now let us take a look at some details. Martin Luther was born on 10 November 1483 in Eisleben, Saxony, Germany. His father, Hans Luther, who prospered in the local copper refining business of the town of Mansfeld, could finance Martin's long education. Luther began his education at a Latin school in Mansfeld in the spring of 1488, where he studied, among other subjects, Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and he was awarded the master's degree in 1505. So the man knew what he was talking about. Okay. In accordance with the wishes of his father, he commenced the study of law. Proudly, he purchased a copy of the Corpus Juris Canonici, corpus of canon law, the collection of ecclesiastical law texts and other important legal textbooks. Less than 6 weeks later, however, on July 17, 1505, Luther abandoned the study of law and entered the monastery in Erfurt of the order of the Hermits of St. Augustine. His studies gave him a thorough exposure to scholasticism by studying the works of Aristotle, 384 to 322 BC, the teacher of Alexander the Great, and his generals, and William of Ockham, 1285 to 1349. Ockham, like Aristotle, focused on the subject of logic because he regarded the science of terms as fundamental and indispensable for practicing all the sciences of things, including God, the world, and ecclesiastical or civil institutions. In all his disputes, logic was destined to serve as his chief weapon against adversaries. Luther received his doctorate in the fall of 1512, and it goes on about his history. Okay, it looks like it goes to the point where this person, Starkey, says on the 15th of June 1520, after 4 all-day meetings, the Pope and his council issued the formal decree known as a papal bull. It's like a decree is like a law, a declaration, right? Legislation became a law. It's known as a bull or the papal bull. Luther was given 60 days to recount or be excommunicated. It's like repent and turn back to the Roman Catholic doctrine dogma, right? He's given 60 days from the church and condemnation to the eternal fires of hell. So they said, right, okay, because you're being a heretic, you're going to go to hell. We condemn you to hell. His works were ordered to be burned. Far from backing down, Luther seemed energized, liberated even, and in a matter of a few mere weeks produced three crucial works that between them amounted to a manifesto for a political and religious revolution. The most important of them was addressed to the Christian nobility of the German nation. Writing in German, Luther called on the German princes unilaterally to reform the German church and rescue it from the clutches of Rome that was bleeding Germany dry. On the 10th of December 1520, he publicly burned the papal bull. There could be no going back. In January 1521, Martin Luther was formally excommunicated from the Catholic Church. Okay, so he was excommunicated. 2 months later, he was charged with heresy and summoned to a hearing in front of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V and representatives of the Church. The Imperial Diet, as it was known, it looks like diet, but it's probably Diet, as it was known, was to be held in the German city of Worms, which looks like worms, but it's probably not worms. It'd be more Worms if it's German. Luther's survival had to date been ensured by Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony. Frederick now secured a promise of safe passage, and Luther set out. If the Catholic Church was hoping to destroy Luther at Worms, it had badly miscalculated the popular mood. Everywhere he went, he was hailed as a hero. 100 horsemen rode through the city gates to escort him inside as he descended his carriage. A monk reached out to touch the hem of his robe by taking on the power of the church. So he was a hero, like they were all protecting him, keeping him safe on his way in. Luther had become a local legend, a figurehead for a populist anti-establishment movement that was spreading across the German-speaking states. As resentment about taxes and foreign interference grew, the Pope's ambassador in Worms was horrified as he reported back to Rome. The whole of Germany is in full revolt, he wrote. 9/10 raised the war cry Luther, whilst the watchword of the other 10th, who are indifferent to Luther, is death to the Roman Curia. Summoned before the Diet, Luther was ordered to renounce his heretical writings. He refused. Here I stand, he is supposed to have declared. I can do no other. Whilst the Emperor Charles V and the Diet were debating Luther's fate, Luther's safe conduct was honoured and he was allowed to leave Worms. Agents of Luther's protector, the Elector Frederick the Wise, charged with bringing him to a place of safety, brought Luther to Wartburg Castle in Saxony, where he was undercover. He went undercover. He grew his hair and beard and became Junker Georg, or Squire George. Up to now, the Bible is not only a sacred text, but also a secret text, which is not available to laymen who could not speak and read Latin. And the main doctrine of the Roman Catholic Church was to keep it like that. Priests of the Church were in charge to interpret the contents of the Bible to the ordinary people, the common folk, and by doing so they kept control over the contents that had been delivered to the audience in church as a means to control them, right? Luther was aware that his reformation would not succeed if the people could not read the Bible for themselves. He was an accomplished linguist, fluent in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, as well as many German dialects of the north and south. Right from the start, Luther was determined to employ all his expertise and abilities to push the Reformation forwards. And above all, he was about to use the most frightening invention of his days, the unstoppable printing press of Johannes Gutenberg, or the Gutenberg press. Has here a quote by Dr. Starkey. Confined to his room, Luther embarked on the next stage of his religious revolution. The medieval church used St. Jerome's 4th century Latin translation of the Greek New Testament known as the Vulgate. It was treated as the sole authoritative text, and crucial Catholic doctrines depended on its particular choice of words. All Luther's religion was rooted in the Bible. He believed in sola scriptura, that the Bible was the sole infallible guide to faith and practice. St. Luther decided to use his time in Wartburg of Württemberg to start afresh and to make his own new translation of the Bible from the original Greek into German. But it was to be as German, pungent, pithy and comprehensible by all Germans, north and south, and above all it was to be his, or Luther's, reading of the Bible. Published in September 1522, Luther's Bible began to fix a standard modern German language. It forged a growing sense of nationhood and national identity amongst the German states, and that helped turn Luther's religious revolution into a political revolution as well. Luther's revolution now threatened to carry all before it. The princes were attracted by the political and economic pride gave them of the common people by the freedom and the autonomy that it seemed to promise them. The term Protestant was coined in 1529, or Protestant. The Lutheran cities and principalities united themselves into a defensive alliance known as the Schmalkaldic League, German Schmalkaldischer Bund, from the town of Schmalkalden in Thuringia. In little more than a decade, half of Germany had gone Protestant, gone Lutheran, as Europe began to fracture along religious lines. It would be engulfed by apocalyptic violence, waves of holy war, terror and iconoclasm, one of the kind we are all too familiar with today. One may ask, what has all this to do with the Bible or my faith? Everything could be the answer. The Bible is a book about faith, about morals, about precepts and laws, yes, but it's also a guide of wisdom that can show one's right way. When Masion, in the middle of the 2nd century, wanted to get rid of the Old Testament due to its sometimes violent attitudes, the Church Fathers disagreed and were determined to keep this Jewish document collection as scripture as well. Were they not right? Perhaps they found it necessary to keep the Old Testament because it represented traditional authority. It breathed resolute fighting spirit, and it contained precepts and wisdom that the New Testament lacked. Had the early Christians followed Masion, who knows, Christianity might have died long ago from its peacefulness. There's not always just one way, but other ways from which we can choose. The Bible in its entirety has accumulated the wisdom from several millennia. It is not the only wise book in the world. In fact, there are many more, and most of them have something in common. The Western communities need headstrong individuals like Jan Hus, like John Wycliffe, like William Tyndale and Martin Luther, who are willingly taking responsibility and do not hide behind a smokescreen of team ethics and coward political correctness, which automatically leads to the wrong belief that appeasement ensures eternal peace. It does not, and it never did, and it never will. The old proverb, weakness provokes, has a Darwinistic truth in itself that no one can escape. Good behaviour has been replaced by despicable egalitarian ideologies. Is that something to do with the ego? Having a big ego? Those ones who propagate diversity, boundless socialism and leniency, limitless individualism and fuzzy immorality. Let the devil take over, and they bring not only their own society to crumble, but they cause suffering on an unprecedented scale in this very minute. Jesus said, every kingdom divided against itself is brought to desolation, and every city or house divided against itself shall not stand. Matthew 12:25. Anybody who does not like Jesus could also be directed to any other authority and philosopher in antiquity, because many of them said the very same thing. The Bible is not out of date, and it is still a mighty authority on wisdom today. The Bible is a valuable source to learn from. It's a book of wisdom, isn't it? You've got Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, etc. that forewarn you, don't mess with that wayward woman, etc., etc. And it gives the reasons why. And then you learn those lessons from experience, if you indulge, etc. We know, because we learn from our mistakes. Those scriptures were put before us and went our wayward way. And then, okay, we had some problems there, even though Christian friends said, don't go there because you'll fall, etc., etc. Yeah, we know better, right? And that's what happened. So it was like a pre-warning, right? Seeing Ecclesiastes and Proverbs, that wisdom there, the wisdom of Solomon. But thought we knew better and suffer the consequences, right? The Bible is a valuable source to learn from, and here it does not matter to what religious denomination the reader feels aligned to or even feels religious at all. This NDE that we watched, this lady said what Christ said to her, well, it's got nothing to do with the religions or the religion or institutions, and most of what's been said that he said, he hasn't said. He never said. They're not his words. That's pretty shocking, surprising, isn't it? Hopefully that NDA was real, that she really experienced that, and that's what he said. And that's what we at the Ministry of the Real Truth are putting forward. Okay, that you have these modern Americanized English translations, supposedly from the original Greek, which aren't. They're from a modern form of that old form of Greek, and so forth. And a lot of people are interpreting it and talking a load of garbage. So you see, therefore it is a sensible thing not to talk about religion, faith or piety here. And this particular person, Lord Henfield, in 2024 states, therefore it is a sensible thing not to talk about religion, faith or piety here. He'd rather should like to steer the reader's attention to historical or other scientific facts of interest. To bring the Bible to the reader in a new light, he would present it in a very old way. Several hundred years ago, some Bibles gave extra information to the reader, and he was aiming to do the same and display a detailed table of contents. This foreword is followed by details on origin, version, and translation of the Bible. Each book in the Bible begins with its name as a title in bold capital letters and all alternative titles that are known. Then they mention the source, provenance, authorship, and the range of dating, the time the text creation. In the appendices, they show a photo documentation and a map documentation. After that, you will find legal, non-canonical, and other texts of historical value, because it is best to let history speak for itself. Yeah, it's like let evidence prove itself evident, etc. If you wish to find more related texts, download the 8,000 page volume of the Grand Bible, 5th edition, and he thanks you for that. Lord Henfield, 2024. Yeah, Grand Bible is great. It covers many religions, from the Torah, the Jewish Torah, the Talmud, etc., etc. It's available online. We can give you a link to that if that's what you want. So if that's what you are interested in, you want that, subscribe to us, give us a like, and let us know in the comments, and we'll give you the link to that. The entire thing, you can download it for free. Introduction. The canon of the Bible, the Hebrew canon. The term canon came from the Greek word kanon, meaning a cane or measuring rod, passed into Christian usage as a norm or as a rule of faith. The Church Fathers of the 4th century AD, that would be the Roman Catholic Church Fathers, first employed it in references to the definitive, authoritative nature of the body of sacred scripture. The Hebrew Bible is often known among Jews as Tanakh. I wonder if in Jewish that K is silent like in the Aramaic. In the Egyptian, so it might be Tanakh. Maybe. Because in the Bible genealogy in Genesis, Cam is known as Ham. It's got a K before it. The K is silent apparently. So I wonder if that, whether to put it as a capital K, maybe. Not too sure. We're not Hebrew experts. We don't speak it natively, etc. Just a possibility. An acronym derived from the names of its official 3 divisions: Torah, instruction or law, also called the Pentateuch, Nevi'im, prophets and Ketuvim writings. The earliest and most explicit evidence of a Hebrew canonical list comes from the Roman Jewish historian Titus Flavius Josephus, who was adopted by the Flavians. He was a Jew, but he was adopted by them. 37 AD to 96 AD, who wrote about the Hebrew canon used in the 1st century AD. In Against Apion, Book 1, paragraph 8, Josephus divided the Hebrew Bible into 3 parts. 5 books of the Torah: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. 13 books of the prophets: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. 12 minor prophets: Job, Ecclesiastes, Daniel, Ezra, and Nehemiah, and Chronicles. And 4 books of hymns: Psalms, Song of Solomon, Lamentations, Proverbs. So that was the person responsible there. He was responsible for the Pentateuch, putting 5 books together of the Torah. For we have not an innumerable multitude of books among us, disagreeing from and contradicting one another, but only 22 books, which contain the records of all the past times, which are justly believed to be divine, and of them 5 belong to Moses, which contain his laws and the traditions of the origin of mankind till his death. Well, we came across statements that the Jews admit that it's attributed to Moses. He didn't actually write them. It was somebody else. Go do the research on that. Don't take us as the experts. We just came across that. Sometimes information online is incorrect. That's why you got to go do the research, find the evidence, and so forth, or have it provided. This interval of time was little short of 3,000 years, but as to the time from the death of Moses till the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, who reigned after Xerxes, the prophets, he's probably got a different name in Persian though, you can't remember what it is. The prophets who were after Moses wrote down in Babylonian captivity what was done in their times in 13 books. The remaining 4 books contain hymns to God and precepts for the conduct of human life. The books of the woman Ruth and Esther were not part of his choice in antiquity. Politics, military, and religion were men's toys. It's all men oriented. Right? What about men? Men were the leaders. Men said this, men did that, etc. Right? As Josephus, as propaganda minister of the Flavian dynasty, had all Roman publishing activities under his control. It is not clear whether he only reported here about the canon or told us about his decision on the canon officially approved by him. The answer to this question would tell us to what extent he might have been responsible for the destruction of the violent messianic literature and their authors. So they're saying that he softened it down, toned it down, omitting stuff, and also about the approval of the first 3 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Josephus mentions Ezra and Nehemiah in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 11, Chapter 5, and Esther during the rule of Artaxerxes in Chapter 6. The canon is until the reign of Artaxerxes, Babylonian captivity, as mentioned by Josephus in Against Apion, Book 1, paragraph 8. So these Jews, the Israelites, these Hebrews, ended up in Babylonia as captives, and apparently they went to do their religious rites, etc., etc., for so many years. And that's why you have that song, that song by Boney M, The Rivers of Babylon, where they sat down at the river, they wept because they're remembering Jerusalem, which was destroyed, and they couldn't do their practices apparently. So over time, that's perhaps why they forgot a lot of stuff, etc., etc. For a long time following this date, the divine inspiration of Esther, the Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes was often under scrutiny. According to Gerald A. LaRue, Josephus' listing represents what came to be the Jewish canon, although scholars were still wrestling with problems of the authority of certain writings at the time that he was writing. Josephus' choice of 22 books were not universally accepted, since most Jewish communities use the 24 books. Okay, so Torah, teaching of the law, 5 books, from Genesis to Deuteronomy. Nevi'im, the prophets, 8 books, former prophets, the latter prophets, and so forth. The Ketuvim, 5 scrolls, 5 Megillot, and other books, Daniel, Ezra, and Chronicles. Getting some more information here. The Christian canon, the Old Testament as it has come down in Greek translation from the Jews of Alexandria, these are Hellenistic Jews, where the Christian church differs in many respects from the Hebrew scriptures. The books of the second and third divisions have been redistributed and arranged according to categories of literature: history, poetry, wisdom, and prophecy. Esther and Daniel contain supplementary materials, so what's that, extra materials? And many non-canonical books, whether of Hebrew or Greek origin, have been interspersed with the canonical works. These extra canonical writings comprise 1 Esdras, the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, Ben Sirah, additional to Esther, Judith, Tobit, Baruch, the Epistle of Jeremiah, and additions to Daniel as listed in the manuscript known as Codex Vaticanus from around 350 AD. The sequence of the books varies, however, in the manuscripts and in the patristic and synodic lists of the Eastern and Western churches, some of which include other books as well, such as 1 and 2 Maccabees. The Christian church received its Bible from Greek-speaking Jews, or Hellenistic Jews, and found the majority of its early converts in the Hellenistic world. Apparently they saw, oh, we can get wealthy, we can live a better life, so we'll adopt that. We'll go there and we'll live that lifestyle, and so forth. Apparently it's all decision on betterment, right? They decide, oh, we can better ourselves, etc., etc., by becoming like citizens or Hellenized Greek, etc. The Christian church received its Bible from Greek-speaking Jews and found the majority of its early converts in the Hellenistic world. The Greek Bible of Alexandria thus became the official Bible of the Christian community, and the overwhelming number of quotations from the Hebrew scriptures in the New Testament are derived from it. Whatever the origin of the apocryphal books in the canon of Alexandria, these became part of the Christian scriptures, but there seems to have been no unanimity as to their exact canonical status. The New Testament itself does not cite the apocryphal books directly, but occasional traces of a knowledge of them are to be found. The Apostolic Fathers, late 1st to early 2nd centuries, that would probably be the disciples, Peter, Paul, etc., etc. The Apostolic Fathers, the late 1st century, early 2nd century, show extensive familiarity with the literature, but a list of the Old Testament books by Melito, Bishop of Sardis in Asia Minor, 2nd century, does not include the additional writings of the Greek Bible. In Origen, around 185, born around 185 to 254, explicitly describe the Old Testament canon as comprising only 22 books. From the time of Origen on, the Church Fathers, this would be the Roman Catholic Church Fathers, who were familiar with Hebrew, differentiated theoretically at least the apocryphal books from those of the Old Testament, though they used them freely. In the Syrian East, until the 7th century, the church had only the books of the Hebrew canon, with the addition of Ecclesiasticus, or the wisdom of Jesus the son of Sirah, but without Chronicles, Ezra and Nehemiah, It also incorporated the wisdom of Solomon, Baruch, the letter of Jeremiah, and the additions to Daniel. The 6th century manuscript of the Peshitta, Syriac version, known as Codex Ambrosianus, also has 3 and 4 Maccabees, 2, sometimes 4 Esdras, and Josephus Wars 7. Full name Origenes Adamatius, born around 185 in Alexandria, Egypt, died 254 in Tyre, Phoenicia, Lebanon. He was one of the most important theologian and biblical scholars of the early Greek Church. His greatest work is the Hexapla, which is a synopsis of the versions of the Old Testament. Yeah, the Syrian East, they basically kept to themselves their manuscripts, their writings from that Thomas gave to the church that he founded, the Apostolic Church of the East, and the rest of them, they basically were for those Syrians alone. So they didn't translate them, hid them, preserved them, etc. while on the move, martyred, killed, etc., etc. Over the centuries, they hid them, therefore preserved them for over 2,000 years. So that's why they didn't have that. They only had the Hebrew and the Greek, by the looks of it. Early councils of the African Church held at Hippo, 393, and Carthage, 397 and 419, affirmed the use of the apocryphal books as scripture. In the 4th century also, Athanasius, chief theologian of Christian orthodoxy, differentiated canonical books from both those that are read by Christians only and the apocryphal books rejected alike by Jews and Christians. Athanasius of Alexandria, born around 293, died May 2, 373 AD, was a theologian, ecclesiastical statesman, and Egyptian national leader from Alexandria. He may not have actually been Egyptian. He might have just been someone from Egypt who resided there. You'd probably have to do research on him to find out if he actually was a native-born Egyptian. He was the chief defender of Roman, Pauline, Flavian or Orthodox Christianity in the 4th century battle against Arianism. In the preparation of a standard Latin version, the biblical scholar Jerome, born around 347, died 419 or 420, separated canonical books from ecclesiastical books, i.e. the apocryphal or hidden writings, which he regarded as good for spiritual edification but not authoritative scripture. Full name Eusebius Hieronymus, pseudonym Sophronius, born 347, Dalmatia, died around 420 AD. Bethlehem, Judea, Holy Land. He is known for his Bible translation into Latin, the famous Vulgate. So that was Jerome's works, by the sounds of it. A contrary view of Augustine, 354 to 430, one of the greatest Western theologians, prevailed, however, and the works remained in the Latin Vulgate version. The Decretum Galatianum, a Latin document of uncertain authorship, but recognized as reflecting the views of the Roman Church at the beginning of the 6th century, includes Tobit, Judith, the Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, and 1 and 2 Maccabees as biblical. Augustine of Hippo, Latin name Aurelius Augustinus, born November 13th, 354, Tagaste, Numidia, Algeria, died August 28, 430, Hippo Regius, Algeria. Augustine was the most influential supporter of merging ancient Platonic and Stoic teachings with Christian ideas and created so modern Roman Christianity, thus Western civilization. So he was the guy that created Roman Christianity by the looks of it. Throughout the Middle Ages, the apocryphal books were generally regarded as holy scriptures in the Roman and Greek churches. Luther's Reformation kept the issue of the Christian canon alive. Protestants denied canonical status to all books not in the Hebrew Bible. The first modern vernacular Bible to segregate the disputed writings was a Dutch version by Jacob van Liesveld, Antwerp, 1526. Luther's German edition of 1534 did the same thing and entitled them Apocrypha for the first time, noting that while they were not in equal esteem with sacred scriptures, they were edifying. In response to Protestant views, the Roman Catholic Church made its position clear at the Council of Trent, 1546, where it dogmatically affirmed that the entire Latin Vulgate enjoyed equal canonical status. This doctrine was confirmed by the Vatican Council of 1870. In the Greek Church, the Synod of Jerusalem, 1672, had expressly designated as canonical several apocryphal works. In the 19th century, however, Russian Orthodox theologians agreed to exclude these works from the Holy Scriptures. The history of the Old Testament canon in the English Church has generally reflected a more restrictive viewpoint. Even though the Wycliffe Bible, 14th century, included the Apocrypha, its preface made it clear that it accepted Jerome's judgment. The translation made by the English Bishop Miles Coverdale, 1535, was the first English version to segregate these books, but it did place Baruch after Jeremiah. Article 6 of the 39 Articles of Religion of the Church of England, 1562, explicitly denied their value for the establishment of doctrine, although it admitted that they should be read for their didactic worth. The first Bible in English to exclude the Apocrypha was the Geneva Bible of 1599. The King James Version of 1611 placed in between the Old and New Testament in 1615. The first Bible in English to exclude the Apocrypha was the Geneva Bible of 1599. This is the Bible that King James didn't like, apparently, and that's why he decided to make a new one, a revision, right? Because he sat on the throne, apparently, and he would have liked to divorce his wife if it came to that, etc., etc. And he was told, no, you can't do that. And he says, yes, I can, because I'm the king. If I'm the king sitting on the throne, I can do whatever I want, when I want, how I want, with whoever I want. And he was dogmatic in that point, apparently. The King James Version of 1611 placed it between the Old and New Testament, probably the Apocrypha. In 1615, Archbishop George Abbott forbade the issuance of Bibles without the Apocrypha, but editions of the King James Version from 1630 on often omitted it from the bound copies. So it was like a decree, it was like a must. You had to have this Apocrypha in between, or else. The Geneva Bible edition of 1640 was probably the first to be intentionally printed in England without the Apocrypha, followed in 1642 by the King James Version. In 1644, the Long Parliament actually forbade the public reading of these books, and 3 years later the Westminster Confession of the Presbyterians decreed them to be no part of the canon. The British and Foreign Bible Society in 1827 resolved never to print or circulate copies containing the Apocrypha. In the new edition of the King James Version from 1885, the disputed books have been omitted. Most English Protestant Bibles in the 20th century have omitted the disputed books or have them as a separate volume, except in library editions, in which they are included with the Old and New Testaments. The Grand Bible, as well as the version edited by Lord Henfield, puts them into the Holy Bible again due to their value for studying Bible history in its completeness. In the appendix are even texts of ancient laws and other texts that can give modern Jews and Christians a new perspective in opposing the decline of their congregation and Western civilization as a whole. See the Muratorian canon, the New Testament canon, page 1647 of this particular edition. Chapters and verses of the Bible. The use of numbered chapters and verses was not introduced until the Middle Ages and later. Chapter and verse divisions did not appear in the original text of Jewish or Christian Bibles. If you take a look at the photos in the appendix of this particular edition, you will see that often not even the words in documents were divided from one another. Since the early 13th century, they make mistakes here, like it says were divided from on another. It should be were divided from one another to make sense. Since the early 13th century, most copies and editions of the Bible have presented all but the shortest of the scriptural books with divisions into chapters, generally a page or so in length. Since the mid-16th century, editors have further subdivided each chapter into verses, each consisting of a few short lines or of one or more sentences. The Jewish divisions of the Hebrew text differ at various points from those used by Christians. Jewish tradition regards the ascriptions to many psalms as independent verses or as parts of the subsequent verses, whereas established Christian practice treats each psalm ascription as independent and unnumbered, resulting in 116 more verses in Jewish versions than in the Christian text. The system used in English was developed by Stephanus Robert Estienne of Paris. History of the chapter division. Early manuscripts of the biblical text did not contain the chapter and verse divisions in the numbered form familiar to modern readers. And that's why Victor Alexander, in one of his many translation versions, like this, Galilean New Testament, left out the names of books and chapters apparently. Something along those lines. Early manuscripts of the biblical text did not contain the chapter and verse divisions in the numbered form familiar to modern readers. In your Bibles that you have today, the ones you read. Ancient Hebrew texts were divided into paragraphs, parashot, that were identified by two letters of the Hebrew alphabet. P indicated an open paragraph that began on a new line, while Samek. S indicated a closed paragraph that began on the same line after a small space. These two letters begin the Hebrew words open, patuach, and closed, satum, and are themselves open in shape and closed. The earliest known copies of the book of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls use parashot divisions, although they differ slightly from the Masoretic divisions. The Hebrew Bible was also divided into some larger sections. In the Holy Land, the Torah, the Pentateuch, were divided into 154 sections so that they could be read through aloud in weekly worship over the course of 3 years. In Babylonia, it was divided into 53 or 54 sections, parashat, ha-shavah, so it could be read through in 1 year. The New Testament was divided into topical sections known as Kephai. How do you say that word? Kephai. Looks like it. Or is that an L? Can't really see it. Except Kephaya. Interesting. By the 4th century, Eusebius of Caesarea, Constantine's right-hand man, divided the Gospels into parts that he listed in tables or canons. Neither of these systems corresponds with modern chapter divisions. Chapter divisions. with titles are also found in the 9th century Tours manuscript, Paris Bibliothèque Nationale MS Lat 3, the so-called Bible of Rodrigo. Cardinal Archbishop Stephen Langton and Cardinal Hugo de Sancto Caro developed different schemas for systematic division of the Bible. In the early 13th century, it is the system of Archbishop Langton on which the modern chapter divisions are based. While chapter divisions have become nearly universal, editions of the Bible have sometimes been published without them. Such editions, which typically use thematic or literary criteria to divide the biblical books, instead include Alexander Campbell's The Sacred Writings, 1826, Daniel Berkeley Updike's 14-volume The Holy Bible containing the Old and New Testaments and the Apocrypha, Richard Moulton's The Modern Reader's Bible, 1907, and Ernest Sutherland Bates' The Bible Designed to be Read as Living Literature, 1936. And it goes on about the history of the first division. And then Bible English. At first, some readers might find the usage of the old pronouns and their verbs difficult. In the King James Version, the Shakespeare speak, thee, thy, thou, thou, wherefore art thou, whither thy go, with that sort of stuff. People get frustrated with that and get confused and baffled, etc. So that's probably why they came out with a better English version, modern English version, the New King James Version. Another feature which might irritate at first might be the sometimes different word order. Instead of I do not know, in older texts we find I know not, sleepeth he not, means does he not sleep, etc. The old Shakespeare speak. We have chosen to represent these people here, Lord Henfield, etc., have chosen to present here the text of the original King James Version, although it contains a few minor mistranslations. So those out there say, oh, it doesn't have any contradictions. Well, actually, here they're saying it has mistranslations. Especially in the Old Testament, where the knowledge of the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Syriac languages was uncertain at the time, because they're not native speakers, right? They're not sure what was actually written. Could have 2 or 3 meanings, smudged or whatever, and they give the wrong word, the wrong translation, right? Interpretation, whatever. Just some examples. Among the most commonly cited errors is in the Hebrew of Job and Deuteronomy, where re'em, with the probable meaning of wild ox or ox, is translated in the King James Version as unicorn. Following in this the Vulgate unicornus and several medieval rabbinic commentators. Otherwise, the translators on several occasions mistakenly interpreted a Hebrew descriptive phrase as a proper name, or vice versa, as at 2 Samuel 1:18, where the book of Jasher or Jasher properly refers not to a work by an author of that name, but should rather be rendered as the book of the upright. In the New Testament, we find Jesus' father referred to as carpenter, although in original Greek we read the word tekton, from tekne, skill, meaning he had a skill, some sort of skill, which means any craftsman or builder, as opposed to metalworker or smith, like i.e. blacksmith, and even master of any art, such as author, creator, planner, poet. So architecton means architect, chief builder means chief builder. Just like arch enemy means chief enemy. Another misinterpretation is the word betray or betrayal in texts that describe the action of Jesus' disciple Judas. And Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went onto the chief priests to betray him unto them. Mark 14:10. The original Greek text, however, does not use the word betray, but hand over. Looking at the fight between Christianity and Judaism, we can assume that this misinterpretation was deliberately created in order to discredit anything that has to do with the words Judas, Jude, Judaism, Judea, Judaean, Judah, Jew from Old French, Jui. Not too sure how to say that. It's J-U-I-U because you don't speak French. Judeans, what was it? Judaeus? Lodios, Yahudah, Judaic, Judais, Judas, and after the sinister Roman Christian anti-Jewish propaganda, all similar words, is today a synonym for treachery, satanic, devilish, and evil. Listeners should feel unwell when hearing these words. The Islamic anti-Jewish propaganda in their so-called perfect book, the Quran, including all other Islamic texts against the Jews. Yes, because in one of those surahs, Surah 2, it says our enemies are the Jews. Yeah, that's what we've come across. Yeah, they had a dislike for the Jews. Has taken this poorly Christian propaganda unchecked and uncriticised as basis of their own bigotry. This single misinterpretation led to almost 2,000 years of Jewish suffering and ultimately to the Holocaust in Hitler's Nazi Europe with more than 6 million dead Jews and so forth. On grammar. Under Martin Luther's influence, William Tyndale began his Bible translation from Hebrew and Greek sources in 1525. Miles Coverdale, Thomas Matthew, John Rogers continued that project in 1535, followed by the Great Bible in 1539 and the Bishop's Bible in 1568. Finally, the Roman Catholics came up with their own Douay Rheims Bible in 1582, when unfortunately it was translated from the outdated Vulgate version. The King James Version, or Authorized Version, was published in 1611 under the auspices of James I of England, who was actually a Scotsman. Not since the Septuagint, around 285 BC, had a translation of the Bible been undertaken under royal sponsorship as a cooperative venture on so grandiose or grand scale. Of 54 scholars approved by James, 47 laboured in 6 groups at 3 locations for 7 years, utilising previous English translations and texts in the original languages. Their translations influence the English language still today. So that was the source. Other versions, other Bible versions, etc. The victory of King James Version could not obscure some inherent weaknesses, errors, and a lack of consistency. The translator's understanding of the Hebrew tense system was often limited, so that their version contains inaccurate renderings. The Greek source text of the New Testament was a poor one. The rediscovery of Greek uncial codices, codes Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, these are, by the sounds of it, all Roman Catholic, right? Of Roman Catholic church fathers, etc., etc. Origins, right? Triggered new reforms. One unfortunate outcome was that the pronouns of the second person singular, thou, thee, thy, thine, thyself, or the old Shakespeare speak, were scrapped, and also the entire Apocrypha that once were approved by Emperor Constantine in 325 AD. So that emperor approved the Apocrypha way back in 325 AD. Being a so-said convert, a Christian pagan in fact, and that he said, well, that's got to be in there, right? You have to have that Apocrypha. He approved it. All those Bible readers who want to come closer to what has been said in the original Hebrew and Greek text ought to use a Bible with distinct thou pronouns. Was that supposed to be pronouns? Thou, Thou, pronouns. I'm sure that's supposed to be pronouns. The word thou is a second person singular pronoun. Now largely archaic. It's very, very old, right? Those languages are long dead. Old English, Middle English, etc. Having been replaced in most contexts by you. Y-O-U. The equalization of these two originally distinct pronouns can cause misunderstanding as to who is meant, either you as a single person or you as a group of people, which in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek and almost all other languages in the world is a big difference in form and sound of the relevant pronouns and verbs that are connected to them. And there's some examples here. Using thou is also reflected in the use of the verb that follows this pronoun. The verbs of the second person singular end with "ist" or "est". A few, it's "est". A few end only with "t", such as art, wilt and shalt. In Bible text there is also another form for the verb in third person singular. In modern English, a verb that follows he, she just ends with, is that an S? But in 1611, when the King James Version was first published, all those verbs ended with eth or th, and so do they still do today in church service. And it goes on about that. And the list of abbreviations of the books of the Bible, you have those in a lot of those older 1960s, 70s, 80s Bibles, right? It goes what's this? Genres in the Bible. Goes into that. Of originals, translations and versions. Before we talk about translations, we need to know what language the Bible authors used and why. The Christian Bible consists of two main canonical works: the Old Testament, that is the entire Hebrew Bible; the New Testament, that is the Christian Bible; and the additional Hebrew Deuterocanon, second canon by Christians known as Apocrypha, hidden books connected to the Hebrew Bible. The Old Testament was composed in Hebrew, the New Testament in Greek, and the Apocrypha in Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek. Also the Old Testament was in the Tab Asheret, the Aramaic, as well as the New Testament, the Galilean Aramaic. It can help to understand the geopolitical environment of the Bible composers. The 4th millennium BC saw three great civilizations in the Middle East: Egypt, Sumer in Mesopotamia, also known as Shinar, and the Indus civilization in the northwest of India. Natural disasters caused migration, it pushed them into other lands, right? Thus new civilizations formed, such as the Semitic Akkadians and Amorites from northern Phoenicia and Lebanon, who began to subjugate the native but exhausted Sumerians. So these people flooded it and possibly became new Sumerians, right? So if you originally had Shinar and then Sumeria, it was given name by the Greeks because it has this IA on the end of it, which is the end prefix from the Greek. Then maybe these people came in and claimed that they were the Sumerians, but they weren't the Sumerians. They weren't the original Shinar, maybe. Indo-European peoples from Iran migrated as well, such as the Elamites, who crushed the last surviving Sumerians, and other Iranian tribes who crushed the likewise exhausted peoples of the Indus civilization of northwest India. Maybe they crushed them in the Indus Valley or the Indus area, attacked them, attacked them, and crushed them. Maybe it's like that. These events occurred at around 2000 BC, and Abraham was one of the protagonists who migrated from Ur in Sumer, it's Ur in Chaldea, right? Or Ur in Shinar, to Haran. You check out the Genesis genealogy of his forefathers, which led up to him, right? Because we read he's in the Ur of Chaldea, Babylonia, right? Not in Sumer. And he moves to Haran, which is named after his father, I believe. It's either his father or his uncle. in Anatolia, and then to Egypt. The people of Abraham, this name is Semitic, a Semitic plural for multitude of people, Abraham. Because prior to that he was called Abram, Abram. They were part of the likewise Semitic Hyksos, Kasut, conquerors from the east, who settled around their new capital Avaris in Goshen in the northeast of Egypt. So this Bart the Ehrman that we watched with what's his name? Myth something. Can't remember his name. Myth Vision. When they're having a debate and he says, "Oh no, it's all it might be all made up," etc., etc. There is the evidence there that they could have been those Hyksos at that particular time. Conquerors from the east, so they probably were Syrians or the Arameans or somebody like that. They ended up there. In scripture, these people were like went against God or something like that, and so they were pushed out, and the punishment was to go to this certain geographical location, i.e. Egypt, and become slaves. We believe this is what we found over the years, right? As part of their punishment from God, these certain people, for turning their back on them. It says you will be punished, you will be pushed to here, and you will become their slaves. These events occurred around 2000 BC, and Abraham was one of the protagonists who migrated from Ur in Sumer, I should say Chaldea, to Haran in Anatolia. Okay, so maybe he moved from there to Sumer and then to... That doesn't make sense, because Ur means city. Yeah? And Ur of Chaldea means city of Chaldea or Chaldea. One of the protagonists who migrated from Ur and Sumer to Haran in Anatolia and then to Egypt. The people of Abraham, this name is a Semitic plural for multitude of people, were part of the likewise Semitic Hyksos, Kasut, or Hasut, because the K silent, conquerors from the east, who settled around their new capital Avaris, okay, also known as Sion, S-I-O-N, and when they moved to Israel, etc., they called it Zion, etc., right? Or something like that, okay. Whose Egyptian name means, Varis in Goshen. It's where Jacob and his family were, and then there was a famine, so they went to Egypt, because Egypt was the land of plenty, in the northeast of Egypt, right? Mose, M-O-S-E, whose Egyptian name means son, and his tribe moved over 400 years later from Egypt to Canaan, taking Akkadian cuneiform, clay stone tablets with the laws on them to Canaan. So were they the Egyptian laws, like the 42 laws of Ma'at? Could there have been those? But didn't he go to the deserts in Sinai on top of the mountain and he was given the laws of God? And so the Hebrew civilization evolved out of Sumerian. The Hebrew civilization evolved out of Sumerian. So in the translation of the Tab Esheret, Brita or Genesis of the Aramaic, that would mean that the Hebrews in that genealogical passage were just a people. They didn't speak that language, right? They didn't have this language, Hebrew. They had probably Akkadian. So they're basically people who dwelled in Sumer. or Sumeria, the Ur of Chaldea. That's what we're thinking. We're not saying that they were Sumerian, but they are people who went to Ur of Chaldea, Mesopotamia, and had descendants there, one of them being Abraham. So the Hebrew civilization evolved out of Sumerian, Akkadian, Canaanite and Egyptian origins, and the Hebrew Bible tells us all about it. The Galilean Aramaic, the Tav Esrit Old Testament does that as well. So they were these people who dwelt in Ur of Chaldea, spoke Akkadian, possibly Akkadian, not Hebrew, and then migrated. Abraham and his family were given that promise of God, a land of plenty, etc., milk and honey, whatever. Take your people there. So they went there. It was already occupied. They went then to out amongst them and then embraced their culture, their religion, their pagan practices, and so forth. And then come out. Descendants come out later, migrated out, and had this Canaanite language, or Ugaritic. Since the Phoenician Canaanites invented the alphabet at Ugarit, Syria, okay, so that's where that Canaanite language came from, the Ugarit, the Canaanite. Syria, in the 14th century BC, it spread like wildfire through the Mediterranean Asia, giving people a written language that can be learned in weeks or even days if one was determined. See, the Hebrew language wasn't developed, wasn't a speaking language developed in Isaac's era. Almost all alphabets in the world developed from this marvelous invention. It replaced the hieroglyphic writing systems that were awkward to use and difficult to learn. Well, the cuneiform was as well, apparently. And they're looking for, the Aramaeans, etc., were looking for an easier way to write. Only those experts, the scribes, etc., etc., the elites could write it effectively. Everyone else found it difficult. Apparently the Egyptians wrote, they had a Semitic language, then they adopted from these foreigners and they changed it and it became Coptic, or some other word, can't remember the other word for it, not Coptic, it was something else. We have to look at this book that we got, Timetables of History by Bernard Green, etc. Yeah, it went from something like left to right to left. There's something like that in this book that we have. It completely changed. Because don't forget, they were descendants of the sons of Noah. Yeah. They were the descendants who became the peoples of Put, Canaan, and Mithraim, or Egypt. So they were closely related, and so forth. So they probably embraced that Syrian, right, the Aramaean, etc., or that, even that Akkadian, something like that. Yeah, it replaced the hieroglyphic writing systems. Demotic, that's the name of the word we're looking for. We're going to say despotic, but that's the wrong word. It's demotic. Their language changed and it became demotic. Pretty sure that's the right word. It replaced the hieroglyphic writing systems that were awkward to use and difficult to learn and therefore expensive. Learning became affordable and laid the foundation of democratic structures. Growing trade made the quickly learned skills of writing and reading a necessity. Translations like those on the Rosetta Stone of Egypt or the rock inscriptions of Emperor Ashoka of India became an important tool of governance. You had Egypt, ancient Egypt, and then has other people, the Phoenicians, probably the Aramaeans, the Syrians, etc., coming in, and they did trade. One had something that the other one liked, and they swapped for that, etc., etc. They supplied them with this and that. These sea people, the Phoenicians, came with boats and took stuff away, etc., etc. Then you might have had others like Asians or even the Indians coming in, because in the Grand Bible it shows a map of the route that the Indians took. These Hindus, these people from Indus, with the Indus Valley, sailed up and went past this grassy area of Egypt, up this canal, and traded with them. New civilizations and their languages appeared. Phoenicians, Aramaeans, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Indians, Chinese, Ethiopians, Arabs, Greeks, Romans, and the Hebrews were always part of them. They developed over time a vast trade network reaching from West Africa on East Asia, controlling the routes on land and as well as on sea with the help of their brothers, the Phoenicians and Carthaginians. These guys had boats, right? Etc. Wars, expulsions, uprisings, defeats, and endless migrations planted into the mind of Hebrews the love for learning. From the 8th century BC onward, Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians imposed by their conquest sprees a new language on the Hebrews, Aramaic. Okay, that's the older sister of the two. Okay. So what it would probably mean there when it says a new language on the Hebrews is those people in the Brita or the Aramaic translation of Genesis into English, where they say they were called the Awer, A-W-E-R, or Awer in the Hebrew, people who crossed over. They made a passage, a journey, i.e. to the land of Canaan, or Canaan. So from the 8th century BC onward, Assyrians, the Babylonians and Persians, imposed by their conquest, spread a new language on the Hebrews, Aramaic, a Semitic language that began to replace the old Akkadian language that they probably used as lingua franca. It's a trendy language at the time, right? Many hundred years later, Jesus and his disciples still spoke Aramaic, Galilean Aramaic, a derivative of the Ninevite Aramaic. Remember, Jonah went to Nineveh and converted all those Syrians there, the Assyrians, as their first language. Hebrew was confined to the Holy Scriptures. So it's what we found doing research, that the Hebrew language was used for everything holy, spiritual within the temple, and the Aramaic was on the outside being used for common stuff like the local news, probably trade, and verbal, right? Non holy or spiritual matters, right? Okay, Hebrew was confined to the Holy Scriptures. From the 7th century BC onwards, Greeks began to colonize all northern coast of the Mediterranean. They changed the Phoenician alphabet into the Greek alphabet and created the most beautiful literature of its time. The conquest of Alexander the Great had dramatic consequences in terms of culture and ideology. Greek became, besides Aramaic, the second lingua franca, or the trendy language at the time, spoken from Spain to India and China. The entire upper class of the Roman Empire spoke Greek. They used a lot of Greek, and they borrowed a lot of their religious stuff as well. They used a lot of Greek loaned words like Christus, Christos, etc. The entire upper class of the Roman Empire spoke Greek, because apparently the Greeks conquered Rome, and then maybe the Romans got it back, something like that, according to histories. The entire upper class of the Roman Empire spoke Greek, including the Jewish people in the Roman Empire, but not those in the Holy Land, probably not in Jerusalem, Israel, etc., but within that Roman Empire, as they had forgotten their old Hebrew language. Maybe when they were captives in Babylonia, They weren't allowed to practice their religion and speak their language, something like that. And that's what happened. They forgot their old Hebrew language. They launched in around 300 BC the monumental task of translating the entire Hebrew Bible into Greek. Hellenized Greek, right? They became Hellenized Greeks. Because the Greeks originally were called the Hellenes. Hellens. Their work became famous as the Septuagint, the 70, or LXX. Apparently there was actually 72. So it's been said. Scribes, etc., that took it from the Hebrew into Greek. Because circa 70 translators were involved. The New Testament was written in Greek quite simply because the authors were sophisticated and Greek-speaking Roman citizens, not poor Hebrew fishermen. So there's the difference here. The Hebrew Bible / Old Testament. The Hebrew Bible was mainly written in Biblical Hebrew, with some portions, notably in Daniel and Ezra, in Biblical Aramaic. Well, there actually is translations that were made of the Old Testament and the New Testament in the ancient Aramaic, in the Galilean Aramaic. Many deny that. From the 6th century to the 10th century AD, Jewish scholars, today known as Masoretes, compared the text of various biblical manuscripts in an effort to create a unified, standardized text. A series of highly similar texts eventually emerged, and any of these texts are known as Masoretic texts, or MT. The Masoretes also added vowel points. That's what we've been saying for quite a while now. They added vowel points called nikud, and the Muslims have similar. You just can't remember what the name of that was. It's something similar to that. Maybe, okay, this is the nikud. Maybe this is the nakut or something like that. Don't know. It's something like that to the text. Since the original text contained only consonants. Yeah, the Aramaic and Hebrew didn't have vowels. They might have had an A or an O, but that was considered a consonant, not a vowel. So it wasn't until these Masoretes added the vowels, right, that things changed. Which in that case would have not only changed the structure of the language, but also the words. So then later Aramaic and Hebrew would have, formerly they had the same words with the same meanings. When the Masoretes got in between and added the vowels to the consonants, then that would have not only changed the structure but also the language. So then they would have had similar words but with different meanings, like Euma in the Aramaic for immeasurable period, era eon, unfathomable period, era eon, or day with capital D, indicating God's day, what he did in his time, because there was no time as such as we know it. It was just infinite space. And then the Jewish word yom, meaning day, lowercase d, indicating a day of the week, or days of the week. See the difference here? Originally the ancient Aramaic and the Hebrew would have been the same word, same meaning. But until these Masoretes got in between and added vowels to the consonants and changed everything. The Masoretes also added vowel points called nikud to the text, since the original text contained only consonants. This sometimes required the selection of an interpretation. Since some words differ only in their vowels, their meanings can vary in accordance with the vowels chosen. In antiquity, variant Hebrew readings existed, some of which have survived in the Samaritan Pentateuch, in other ancient fragments, as well as being attested in ancient versions in other languages. We have come across claims that the Samaritans were disliked by the Pharisees, etc. These Jews in around Jesus' era, because they're from Samaria, supposedly Syrians. We're not too sure on that though. Because sometimes what you read is actually wrong. Right? In antiquity, variant Hebrew readings existed, some of which have survived in the Samaritan Pentateuch and other ancient fragments, as well as being attested in ancient versions in other languages. First steps: Targums, translations into Aramaic, for side-by-side reading. The most important factor in the history of Mesopotamia in the 10th century BC was the continuous threat from the Aramaean nomads. Repeatedly, the kings of both, and they also had problems with the Hittites, right, etc. Repeatedly, the king of both Babylonia and Assyria were forced to repel the invasions. Even though the Aramaeans were not able to gain a foothold in the main cities, there are evidence of them in many rural areas, like Ur of Chaldea, etc. We have spoken with Assyrians, and they've said not so nice things about that. They won't talk about that history. They said these people came in and invaded and caused trouble, this sort of stuff. That's according to a native Assyrian, right? That we've come across in comments on YouTube and people we've met who are Syrians. Aramaic replaced Akkadian. So way back then, it replaced Akkadian, that Abraham, etc. were probably speaking, and became the official language of Assyria, Babylonia, and even in the following Persian Empire. Thus, Aramaic also became the lingua franca of the Jews, the Judeans, etc. It was the bee's knees language. It was the Trinity language at that time. Everybody spoke and wrote in. Some of the first translations of the Torah began during the Assyrian and Babylonian exile from the 8th to the 6th centuries, when most people were speaking only Aramaic and not understanding Hebrew, because again Hebrew was developed later on in Isaac's era. The Targums were created to allow the common person to understand the Torah as it was read in ancient synagogues. In the succeeding centuries, it was used as the vernacular over a wide area and was increasingly spoken by the post-exilic Jewish communities of Palestine and elsewhere in the diaspora, or that division. They were scattered, right? Among the scattered. In response to liturgical needs, the institution of a Turgumen or Mertugumen, M-E-T-U-G-E man, Mertugumen, translator, arose in the synagogues. These men translated the Torah and prophetic lectionaries into Aramaic. The rendering remained for long solely an oral impromptu exercise, but gradually, by dint of repetition, certain verbal forms and phrases became fixed and eventually committed to writing. There are several Targums, translations of the Pentateuch. The Babylonian Targum is known as Onkelos, named after its reputed author. The Targum is Palestinian in origin, but it was early transferred to Babylon, where it was revised and achieved great authority. At a later date, probably not before the 9th century AD, it was re-exported to Palestine to displace other local Targums. On the whole, Onkelos is quite literal, but it shows a tendency to obscure expressions attributing human form and feelings to God. It also usually faithfully reflects rabbinic exegesis. So it's probably saying it's very, very rabbi or rabbinic oriented. The most famous of the Palestinian Targums is that popularly known as Jonathan, a name derived from a 14th century scribal mistake that solved a manuscript abbreviation, TJ, as Targum Jonathan, instead of Targum Jerusalem. In contrast with two other Targums, which are highly fragmentary, Jerusalem 2 and 3, Pseudo Jonathan, or Jerusalem 1, is virtually complete. It is a composite of the Old Palestinian Targum and an early version of Onkelos with an admixture of material from diverse periods, or different periods, right? A range of different periods. It contains much rabbinic material as well as homiletic and didactic amplifications. There is evidence of great antiquity, but also much late material, indicating that Pseudo-Jonathan could not have received its present form before the Islamic period, or the Mohammedan period, right? Another extant Aramaic version is the Targum to the Samaritan Pentateuch. It is less literal than the Jewish Targum, and its text was never officially fixed. The Targum to the prophets also originated in Palestine and received its final editing in Babylonia. It is ascribed to Jonathan ben Uziel, a pupil of Hillel. Is that the one that Paul was under? I'm not sure if it was it. No, that was Gamaliel, right? The famous 1st century BCE to 1st century CE rabbinic sage. Ah, yeah, okay. Though it is in fact a composite work of varying ages. In its present form, it discloses a dependence on Onkelos, though it is less literal. The Aramaic renderings of the Hagiographa are relatively late productions, none of them antedating the 5th century AD. Nothing earlier, supposedly. We think that's what it says. Before the 5th century. The Masoretic text, or MT from Hebrew Masoreth tradition, traditional Hebrew text of the Jewish Bible, meticulously assembled and codified, made into a book form, right? And supplied with discritical marks to enable correct pronunciation. It's probably like hyphens and all that sort of stuff. This monumental work was begun around the 6th century AD and completed in the 10th by scholars at Talmudic academies in Babylonia and Palestine, in an effort to reproduce as far as possible the original text of the Hebrew Old Testament. Their intention was not to interpret the meaning of the scriptures, but to transmit to future generations the authentic Word of God. To this end, they gathered manuscripts and whatever oral traditions were available to them. The Masoretic text that resulted from their work shows that every word and every letter was checked with care. In Hebrew or Aramaic, they called attention to strange spellings and unusual grammar and noted discrepancies in various texts. Some texts traditionally omitted vowels in writing. The Masoretes introduced vowel signs to guarantee correct pronunciation. Among the various systems of vocalization that were invented, the one fashioned in the city of Tiberias, Galilee, probably a city named after Tiberius, the emperor of Rome at one point, eventually gained ascendancy. In addition, signs for stress and pause were added to the text to facilitate public reading of the scriptures in the synagogue. When the final codification of each section was complete, the Masoretes not only counted and noted down the total number of verses, words and letters in the text, but further indicated which verse, which word and which letter marked the center of the text. In this way, any future emendations could be detected. The rigorous care given the Masoretic text in its preparation is credited for the remarkable consistency found in the Old Testament Hebrew text since that time. The Masoretic work enjoyed an absolute monopoly for 600 years, and experts have been astonished at the fidelity of the earliest printed versions, late 15th century, to the earliest surviving codices, late 9th century. The Masoretic text is universally accepted as the authentic Hebrew Bible. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947 has co-affirmed the effort of those scholars as largely correct. Then there's the older Tab Asherit, etc. They were made, codices made into book format. The Apostolic Church of these manuscripts, the Tab Asherit, the Shana Articus Player, and the Galilean Aramaic, were they made into Bible formats in those ancient eras or codices? So maybe they were older than these Masoretic texts. The Masoretic text is universally accepted as the authentic Hebrew Bible. Yeah, that's the authentic Hebrew. I don't think it's indicating the authentic Aramaic or Galilean Aramaic Bible. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran in 1947 has confirmed that effort of those scholars as largely correct. But didn't they say it was actually written in ancient Aramaic? The New Testament was written in Koine Greek, Common Greek, and nearly all modern translations are to some extent based upon the Greek text. Okay? The New Testament was written in Koine Greek. It's ancient Greek, right? It's probably long dead. They've got a new Greek, modern Greek, probably a Latinized Greek and then a modern Greek, etc. And nearly all modern translations are to some extent based upon the Greek text, because your Western scholars favour, your theologians, etc., they favour the Western terminology and the Western theology. They could be paid shills, getting a lot of cash, making a lot of money, so they like that because you can buy everything that they want, dream of, keeps them wealthy and healthy, and so forth. They call them shills, right? They'd be paid to speak a whole lot of rubbish, write a whole lot of rubbish as well. So they favour the Greek over the Eastern text, right? The Aramaic, etc. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek, Common Greek. Yeah, it's translated into that. Yeah, because as Victor Alexander, the translator of the Aramaic New Testament, right, states, Koine Greek is akin to the Aramaic. That's where it was. It's very close to that. If you translated the Galilean Aramaic, the Koine Greek, you'd find that it's very near or very close to what's been said in the Galilean Aramaic. That's what Victor Alexander, the translator, has stated on his translation project at va.com, which is down, and we resurrected it. Okay. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek, Common Greek, and nearly all modern translations are to some extent based upon the Greek text. The autographs, the Greek manuscripts written by the original authors or collators, have not survived. There's a lot of them in small chunks, right? Size of a mobile phone SIM card, etc., etc., according to theologian, scholar Bart de Ehrman. What they call it, P52 or P22 or something like that, or 76 or whatever. The three main textual traditions of the Greek New Testament are sometimes called the Alexandrian text type, the Byzantine text type, and the Western text type. Most variants among the manuscripts are minor, such as alternative spelling, alternative word order, the presence or absence of an optional definite article, as in the, and so on. Occasionally a major variant happens when a portion of a text was missing or for other reasons. Examples of major variants are the endings of Mark, the pericope adulteri, the comma Johannum, and the Western version of Acts. The discovery of older manuscripts which belong to the Alexandrian text type, including the 4th century Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, led scholars to revise their view about the original Greek text. Karl Lachmann based his critical edition of 1831 on manuscripts dating from the 4th century and earlier, to argue that the Textus Receptus must be corrected according to these earlier texts. Early manuscripts of the Pauline epistles, or those of Paul, letters of Paul, etc., and other New Testament writings show no punctuation whatsoever. The punctuation was added later by other editors according to their own understanding of the text. There is also a long-standing tradition owing to Papias of Hierapolis around 125 that the Gospel of Matthew was originally in Hebrew. Eusebius around 300 reports that Pantrinus went to India around 200 and found them using a Gospel of St. Matthew in Hebrew letters. Jerome also reported in his preface to St. Matthew that it was originally composed in Hebrew letters in Judea, not in Greek, and that he saw and copied one from the Nazarene sect. Nazarene sect. So would that have been in that Aramaic? The exact provenance, authorship, source, languages, and collation of the four Gospel is unknown, but subject to much academic speculation and disputed methods. The Samaritan Pentateuch. The importance of the recension known as the Samaritan Pentateuch lies in the fact that it constitutes an independent Hebrew witness to the text written in a late and developed form of the Paleo-Hebrew script. Some of the Exodus fragments from Qumran demonstrate that it has close affinities with a pre-Christian Palestinian text type and testify to the faithfulness with which it has been preserved. It contains about 6,000 variants from the Masoretic text, of which nearly a third agree with the Septuagint. Is that the Jewish one or the Greek one? Only a minority, however, are genuine variants, most being dogmatic, exegetical, grammatical, or merely orthographic in character. The Samaritan Pentateuch first became known in the West through a manuscript secured in Damascus in 1616 by Pietro della Valle, an Italian traveller. It was published in the Paris 1628-45 and London Polyglots 1654-57, written in several languages in comparative columns. Many manuscripts of the Samaritan Pentateuch are now available. The Avisha scroll, the sacred copy of the Samaritans, has recently been photographed and critically examined. Only Numbers chapter 35 to Deuteronomy chapter 34 appears to be very old, the rest stemming from the 14th century. A new definitive edition of the Samaritan Pentateuch was being prepared in Madrid by F. Perez Castro. Dead Sea Scrolls from Qumran and other texts. Until the discovery of the Judean Desert Scrolls, the only pre-medieval fragment of the Hebrew Bible known to scholars was the Nash Papyrus, around 150 BC, from Egypt, containing the Decalogue and Deuteronomy. Now, however, fragments of about 180 different manuscripts of biblical books are available. Their dates vary between the 3rd century BC and the 2nd century AD, and all but 10 stem from the caves of Qumran. All are written on either leather or papyrus in columns and on one side only. The most important manuscripts from what is now identified as Cave 1 of Qumran are a practically complete Isaiah scroll, 1Q A, dated around 175 BC, and another very fragmentary manuscript, 1QLSAB, or sub, of the same book. The first contains many variants from the Masoretic text in both orthography and text. The second is very close to the Masoretic type and contains few genuine variants. The richest hoard comes from K4 and includes fragments of 5 copies of Genesis, 8 of Exodus, 1 of Leviticus, 14 of Deuteronomy, 2 of Joshua, 3 of Samuel, 12 of Isaiah, 4 of Jeremiah, 8 of the minor prophets, 1 of Proverbs, and 3 of Daniel. Cave 11 yielded a Psalter containing the last third of the book in a form different from that of the Masoretic text, as well as a manuscript of Leviticus. The importance of the Qumran scrolls cannot be exaggerated. Their great antiquity brings them close to the Old Testament period itself, from early as 250 to 200 BC. For the first time, Hebrew variant texts are extant and all known major text types are present. Some are close to the Septuagint, others to the Samaritan. Is that the Jewish Septuagint? On the other hand, many of these scrolls are practically identical with the Masoretic text, which thus takes this recension back in history to pre-Christian times. Several texts in the Paleo-Hebrew script show that the script continued to be used side by side with the Aramaic script for a long time. Of quite a different order are scrolls from other areas of the Judean desert. All of these are practically identical with the received text. This applies to fragments of Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Ezekiel and Psalms discovered at Masada, the Jewish fortress destroyed by the Romans in AD 73, as well as to the finds at Wadi al-Murabba. Is that al or at? Looks like At, Murabba At, the latest date of which is AD 135.